Half of the Oxford Character Project and a blueprint for better business, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar discussion of crises and capitalism, how to fix them. A new and important book by Professor Colin Mayer that makes a wonderful contribution to current debates about the future of capitalism, corporate purpose, and moral leadership. My name is Edward Brooks, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oxford Character Project here at the University of Oxford, which through research and educational programs seeks to advance character-based leadership across different sectors. It's my privilege to be chairing our discussion today, which will begin with our panelists and then incorporate questions from the audience. So please do put those into the chat, and you can do that at any point. We do have four tremendous panelists with us today. In the first instance, we have the author of Capitalism and Crises, Colin Mayer, who is Emeritus Professor of Management Studies at the Blavatnik School of Government and Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. He's a Fellow of the British Academy, the Centre of Economic Policy Research, and the European Corporate Governance Institute, and has been a leading voice in the area of corporate purpose for over a decade, conducting pioneering research and leading broad programs with industry as well, including the British Academy's Future of the Corporation program. Colin's book is the latest and culmination in many years of research and publications and writing, and we're excited to have you here, Colin, and grateful for that, and looking forward to discussing this latest and excellent book. Sarah Gillard is CEO of A Blueprint for Better Business, which is an independent charity at the heart of work to advance purpose-led business in the UK and beyond. Sarah is on a mission to humanize business and has over 25 years of experience in leadership positions in some of the UK's largest retail companies to draw on. Sarah joined Blueprint in 2022 from her role as Director of Purpose and Special Projects at the John Lewis Partnership, and it's great to have you, Sarah. David Rouch is partner of Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer, where he specializes in financial services regulation. Known for cutting-edge legal work and his thought leadership in the areas of sustainability, social capital, and trust. David is the author of The Social License for Financial Markets, Reaching for End and Why It Counts, a wonderful book published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020, and well worth looking up also. And finally, last but not least, it's wonderful to have Andrew Hill with us. Andrew is senior business writer at the Financial Times and consulting editor of FT Live. He joined the FT in 1988 and has worked across the organization in New York, in Brussels, in Milan, here in London, occupying multiple editorial positions and winning many awards along the way as a business journalist and commentator. Andrew's own books include Leadership in the Headlines, which is a superb collection of his columns on leadership and management that I much enjoyed. Andrew also wrote an excellent review of Colin's book in the FT last month. So if you want a guide to get you started, that's a good place to turn as well. I'm going to now hand over to Colin, who will introduce the book before comments from each of our panelists, and we will go from there into discussion. As I say, please do add your questions into the chat at any point, and we will endeavour to incorporate as many of those as we can. Thank you very much to our panelists. Colin, over to you.
Edward, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me to talk on my book. Capitalism is the most powerful engine we've ever invented, and business is the most important component of it. It clothes, feeds, and houses us. It employs us and it invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity, alleviation of poverty, and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of growing environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. And in particular, it's been associated recently with this phenomenon. This slide is an anagram representation of the relative frequency of the use of the word crises. And it shows that the word crisis grew in significance around the time of the two world wars, not surprisingly, and then during the oil price crisis, and has grown through into this century. And this shows a similar representation for the change in the relative frequency of the use of the word capitalism, which came into the lexicon around about the time of freedom of incorporation in the middle of the 19th century, grew in significance around the Great Depression, and then again the oil price crisis, and it too has increased during this century. But it's looking when the two words are juxtaposed against each other that the most interesting picture emerges. And that is that the association of capitalism with crises first rose to prominence during the Great Depression, not surprisingly, then again during the oil price crisis, but it has really exploded over this century. And if you think that the word polycrisis was a phenomenon that was a post-pandemic, then this slide shows you that, in fact, it appeared at the beginning of this century. And it's not surprising, given the number of crises that we've had, such as the financial crisis, the pandemic, the environmental crisis, inflation crisis, etc., that this has been happening. Now, the reason why it's been happening is the fuel that powers capitalism, and that is profit. Profit is the source of the resources, and it's the incentive that mobilizes capitalism. Without profit, there's no capital in capitalism. But we're misconceiving the nature of profit. Profit derives from the Latin proficere perfectus, to advance and progress, but far too frequently, and in particular recently, it has been associated with neither advancement nor progress. And to understand why that's the case, we should just lift up the hood of capitalism briefly and look underneath the bonnet at the engine of capitalism. This depicts what that is, that the profit that firms earn is, of course, the difference between their revenue and their measured costs in terms of their labor costs, supply costs, capital costs, etc. And the difference between that and revenue is what we measure here in Gray as measured profit. And Gray is appropriate because that is not actually the profit of firms, because it doesn't account for the fact that companies cause detriments to their employees and not paying a living wage, to their supply chain of not paying a fair price, to the environment in terms of pollution, biodiversity loss, and emitting global warming gases. In other words, they're not accounting for their true costs of either avoiding detriments or cleaning them up where they cause the mess. So the measured profit is not a reflection of the fair or just profit. And when companies declare their accounts as being true and fair representations of their financial position, in many respects, they're not doing either of those. They're not true because they don't reflect the true costs of the business, including the costs of avoiding detriments or cleaning up the mess. And they're not fair because they're not then referring to a just or fair profit. But it's not just a problem of the costs being overstated, they're also understated. They're understated because companies cannot always earn revenues from the benefits that they confer in terms of training their labor force, in terms of investing in their societies and cleaning up the environment. So a lot of the profit they cannot actually earn. Now, there's a difference between the two. Companies can incur the costs of cleaning up the mess, but they can't simply magic up the revenue streams that are needed to reward them for the benefits that they are conferring. And that requires them to have innovative and novel ways of trying to develop business models from the benefits that they're conferring. Now, we regard this problem as essentially being an externality. That's to say, it's a problem in terms of competition in markets, regulation, taxation, and reputation of firms. But it's not extrinsic or external to firms. It's very much intrinsic and internal to the nature of the capitalist system. And because we're misdiagnosing the problem, we're also prescribing the wrong policy solutions. Competition fails because companies that are incurring their true costs and earning just profits cannot compete against those companies that are not incurring their true costs, earning excess profits. And as a consequence, capital flows from good firms that are earning just profits based on their true costs to bad firms that are not and earning larger profits and higher returns on their capital. In essence, competition does not create a run to the top, it creates a run to the bottom, essentially a form of bad firms driving out the good. Now, regulation likewise fails because companies employ the substantial resources that they have at their disposal to lobby against the imposition of regulation, and they employ consultants to help them avoid regulation and turn it to their competitive advantage. And similarly with taxation. The notion of reputation aligning interests in the long term also doesn't work. Of course, we appreciate that companies earn profits and we admire them for doing so, provided that they do so on the basis of creating benefits for us, not earning those profits from detriments. But where they do earn them from detriments, for example, during the financial crisis, or what the water companies have been doing in terms of earning profits and paying their executives handsomely on the basis of discharging untreated sewage into rivers, lakes, and seashores, we're justifiably outraged. But that outrage and the consensus around that outrage does not translate into consensus around what to do. So in terms of the socialist left, the notion of regulation as being important in terms of controlling this is emphasized, and the need to really enforce that regulation. But on the libertarian right and the anti-woke brigade, the response to that is to say, no, 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 that's an inhibition of our freedoms and liberties, and it gives rise to what's observed in this slide here. That is to say, it reduces the overall level of activity in an economy. It comes at the price of growth and jobs. And so far from there being any consensus about what to do about it, there are divisions. And this is giving rise to the types of polarization that we're observing in our societies and in our policies and politics. And it's giving rise to the pressures that are being put on the democratic system and the rise of populism. Now, what's required instead is to recognize that we need to shift from what I describe here as being wading through the weaves of entanglement, expropriation, and exploitation and unjust enrichment, and instead elevate our ambitions to riding the waves and surfing the waves of initiative, innovation, and inspiration through finding ways of earning just profits from creating benefits, not from imposing detriments on others. And once one does that, once one elevates the objectives of companies from wading in the weeds of entanglement, exploitation, and unjust enrichment, instead innovating and showing initiative and inspiration in terms of earning profits from their true costs, then two remarkable things happen. First of all, the competition, far from creating a run to the bottom, creates a run to the top, where good firms are outcompeted by better firms that are able to earn this just profit increment. And even more significantly, we align the interests of companies that are earning just profits with the interests of the public sector in promoting public benefits, and in the charitable sector in terms of promoting environmental and social benefits. And that gives rise to a real partnership between the private sector and the public sector and the charitable sector around common purposes of shared prosperity. Now, what I want to emphasize is that this phenomenon is something that really has as its basis a moral problem. And the solution derives from the principles that both the Oxford Character Project and Blueprint for Better Business emphasize. It's striking that we have a philosophy of virtually every element of life: art, history, language, mathematics, mind, politics, religion, and science, but we don't have a philosophy of business. We have business ethics, and we express moral judgments about the conduct of business, but not its existence, reason, values, mind, knowledge, and language. We regard it as just an offshoot of individuals who own it. We do not do the same for government, religion, or science. Existence and reason are central to consideration of the way in which religion and science and government operate, but it's not for business. But existence, reason, values, mind, knowledge, and language are in some respects even more important for business than other institutions in our lives because of its centrality. I argue in the book that the existence and reason for business is precisely the opposite of what is how it's currently conceived, namely a private, self-reflecting entity that creates social benefits from the pursuit of those private considerations in competitive markets. It's actually an other-regarding social entity that derives its private rewards from the benefits it confers on others. In other words, it profits from producing solutions, not problems for others, and it exists to produce profitable solutions, not problems for others. The book describes how law, ownership, measurement, accounting, finance, government, and regulation achieve this. But in the spirit of the Character Project, the component I want to emphasize is leadership, because producing profitable solutions, not problems for others, is the best principle of good leadership that we can teach. It's the principle that has guided the best times of the organizations that all the commentators in this session have experienced: the John Lewis Partnership, the FT, and Freshfields. And a failure to abide by this principle has been the cause of the worst times they've experienced, some of them recently. It emphasizes that business is about solving problems, that the problem solving has to be profitable. It's not charity or philanthropy. The profit cannot derive from creating problems for others, and that companies have to incur the true costs of avoiding detriments for others, thereby earning a just or fair profit. To do this, the leadership must recognize that the company has a real interest in and understanding of the well-being of those it affects, and that this cannot be done from the top of the organization. A business needs to establish clarity about its purpose, values, and culture that support it, and then delegate decision-taking down the organization. Now, I illustrate this in the book in relation in particular to one particular example. It comes from the most troubled industry that we've had over the last 20 years, namely banking, and it's one of the most successful banks in Europe and arguably in the world. It's had a very strong financial ratio. It has a purpose of being the bank with the best customer relationships of any bank. And it's a bank that also emphasizes having one of the lowest cost bases of any bank. And it's been very successful in achieving its targets in terms of being a bank with the highest customer levels of satisfaction and loyalty of customers, and also in terms of one of the lowest cost bases and therefore highest rates of return for its investors. The bank is not a British bank, it's the Swedish bank, Handelsbanken. And what has been the feature of the leadership of this bank since the 1970s, when it nearly went bankrupt, is that it inverts the nature of the bank from being run from the top to being run from the bottom. And the mantra of the bank is the branch. What that has allowed it to do is to instill the values and the culture in the organization that support its purpose of being a bank with the most satisfied customers and the lowest cost base. And it's allowed it to put trust in people at the bottom so that they in turn can really understand the problems of the companies and people with whom they interact, the customers of the bank, and help to support them. In other words, it's doing exactly what I'm talking about here. It's translating a traditional model of a bank, of being a transactional one, wading in the weeds, of trying to sell products at the highest price, to being one that's surfing the waves of inspiration and creating, in essence, an old-style relationship type of banking in which the success of the bank is tied in with the success of their customers, and it therefore helps to promote the success of its customers in the long term. So I'd like to just end by suggesting that this illustrates the type of principle that I'm talking about, of how the notion of character and leadership and a purpose of producing profitable solutions, not problems, can really transform the nature of business. Thank you.
Colin, thank you. Absolutely terrific, and a super overview of the book to get us started. Thank you for delving wonderfully with such clarity into the challenge with some deep diagnosis and then some promise as well, and landing us beautifully on this theme of purpose with the example from Handelsbanken, which can take us, I think, wonderfully to Sarah, whose work here is all about helping organizations develop that clarity around what their purpose is, but not to settle there, to drive that deeply into organizations. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you so much, Colin, for writing the book and for giving us that overview. I think I love your kind of analogy of capitalism being the most powerful engine and business being, you know, the most powerful kind of organizer of all of that energy that we've had. And I think that, you know, if ideas shape the course of history, that engine is currently running on dirty fuel quite rapidly in the wrong direction. So I think your kind of approach of, well, how do we clean up the fuel? How do we make our idea of profit cleaner, just? And how do we make sure that that machine is pointed in the right direction, as in the long-term flourishing of people and planet, rather than just sort of narrow financial goals, is a really useful one in bringing some clarity to this topic. So I mean, I obviously read the book, and I think what it does so brilliantly is it recognizes that business is part of a broader system, along with government and regulators and the financial system and the education system and the natural world and society at large, and that understanding its role in that interconnected system is a really critical part of enabling it to be reimagined in service of people and planet. And I think much of the trouble historically has come from us over the last 60 years, perhaps seeing all those elements of the system as separate and not interdependent, and therefore looking at the outputs of each element and judging them on their own rather than the effect they have on each other and the outcomes they have for the system at large. So I think that that's a very useful kind of helicopter view, and also the sort of revelation that that system is not it's not a law of physics. It is a result of decisions that we have made and sort of designs that were intended to achieve one thing and are actually achieving another. So I think for me that gave a lot of hope that alternatives are possible. You know, if this is a result of design and decision rather than physics and destiny, then alternatives are possible. And I think what you do in the book is bring some real clarity to how that design might be shifted towards an outcome that is actually just better for people and planet. So brings very useful clarity in what otherwise can be quite a sort of overwhelming and paralyzing sense of complexity. So I think, you know, the clarity about what we're aiming for, human and planetary flourishing, not just for some, but for all. The how might we reimagine a system and the elements within it in order to achieve that, by rethinking, you know, what business is for, how do we define profit, what are the underlying assumptions and beliefs that go into this design of the system, how do we think about outcomes rather than just outputs, because of course once you begin to imagine alternative futures you can begin to build it. And I really loved how you sort of begun the book by saying, of course you sort of look at what is, but you also try and imagine what might be possible, because if you only look at what is, it's very hard to move from where we are to where we might want to get to. And I think the kind of recognition that there's no silver bullet and that it's not going to happen overnight, but that there are examples, real life examples right now, whether it's Denmark as a country or Handelsbanken or Novo Nordisk or, you know, wherever else, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So it is possible already in this, even in this existing system, to operate in such a way that you are creating profitable solutions for people and planet and not trying to profit from creating those problems. That is already happening, even in the sort of competitive environment that we face. So I thought it was an extraordinary book that gave a systems view of where we are now and where we might get to, by taking the two most sort of extraordinarily powerful forces of human nature and its ingenuity and our desire for meaning and autonomy and contributing to something greater than ourselves, and the sort of power of business to harness resources and energy and achieve previously unimaginable outcomes, and take both of those and sort of, rather than just hoping that magically they will on their own create the best of all possible worlds, that by sort of intentional design, you can have both of those forces oriented towards human and planetary flourishing. And I think it aligns very well with blueprint thinking on the role of business being to create value by serving society and respecting the dignity and value of people by recognizing their full humanity, and the importance of building trust between people and business and society. So I think that the kind of underlying theme that this is a relational, not transactional, and it's been our misunderstanding of the nature of profit and the sort of the nature of capitalism that sort of led us here is really extraordinarily useful. And I think, as you said in the introduction as well, avoiding these binaries and the polarization that is currently alive in the world at the moment, you know, capitalism versus socialism, or demanding that elements of the system act altruistically or not in their nature. I think you avoid all of those sort of dangers, and you make a clear and coherent case for a system design that allows each element to play its role, play its part in creating outcomes that are going to be beneficial for us all, by recognizing how each element interacts with the different other elements, and that sort of reimagining how the system might work is, and by sort of redesigning it makes better outcomes not just possible but likely, because it is designed to be so. So I think it really sort of, without sort of using the force of regulation or the hope of altruism, it creates a very realistic path to designing a system that's actually going to produce better outcomes. So I sort of note towards the end, you talk about the opportunity we now have to rediscover humanity and wisdom. And you also quote Milton Friedman in one of the quotes that I prefer of his, which is that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. Given, as you said, that we are in the age of polycrisis, I've just got a couple of questions for you to respond at the end. What are your thoughts on what might catalyze change towards this reimagined system? How might we strengthen the moral leadership that you talk about as being required to help navigate us there? And finally, maybe a reflection and a question. Your book to me is hopeful. Is that a fair reflection? You know, are you still optimistic? And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. David, how hopeful are you? And how did you find reading Colin's book for the state of that hope? Love to hear, and love to hear your reflections as well in relation to your brilliant work on social license when it comes to business and business purpose.
Well, I have a personal motto, which is never give up. So I'm not going to answer your question directly. I think there's a very strong sense with this book of Colin attempting to pass on a bit of a baton, and it's a fairly hefty baton, because his contribution, especially on corporate purpose, has been considerable, as we've been hearing. So it's unsurprising that the book, in this sort of process of baton passing, pushes us to take another major step forward. And I felt it was doing that in two ways. First, in the full-throated call for a genuine debate in business and beyond on what we really want from business activity. Is financial return enough? And if not, what outcomes do we really value? And we've heard that again very much in what Colin's just been saying. And then second, as Sarah was highlighting, in highlighting that the fact that many of our core goals can't really be achieved by individuals or companies acting in isolation, but they depend on interaction in systems. Now, on the second of those, there's been increasing attention to systems in the context of tackling sustainability challenges, and the recognition that investors and investee companies are part of and impact on the very systems on which they depend is fundamentally reshaping the way that we're thinking about business and applicable legal rules as well. And for more on that, look at a recent paper from the Financial Markets Law Committee on trustees' duties. Colin was on the working group along with me, and also a multi-jurisdictional report that I co-authored for the UNEP a couple of years ago called A Legal Framework for Impact. But turning to the first issue, what we really want from business, this seems to me still to be very much the subject of displacement activity, and I agree with Colin on this, as people are trying to convince themselves using concepts like stakeholderism that positive social and environmental outcomes align with narrow financial return, or more disingenuously, they just ignore the fact that sometimes, or maybe often, they don't. Now, as I argue in my own book on this, the one that Ed mentioned, The Social License for Financial Markets, that needs to change urgently. And again, I agree with Colin on that. It's not that business people don't aspire towards goals that transcend the purely financial. And in that sense, Colin's call reflects, I think, a common human desire. But currently, the aspiration suffocates in an environment substantially shaped by a set of Wolf of Wall Street narratives about the purpose of business, where purpose is a cutthroat process of pursuing narrow financial return. Where I think I differ from Colin, though, is just in how we might give those aspirations a little bit more oxygen. And this is where I think Sarah's questions are pointing us. Colin puts quite a significant emphasis on legal reform. And I think he's absolutely right that rules are important. But I think the key rules aren't so much laws as social rules, what Pierre Bourdieu referred to as habitus, or the grammar of society, if you like. Behavioral norms. The behavioral norms, like language, are ultimately absorbed rather than enforced by law. It's not simply a case of there is a legal duty, therefore I act. Legal rules can shape behavior, but they also give expression to and depend on social norms. So for an example of that, think of enforced charging for plastic bags in supermarkets, which was successful because there'd already been a change of hearts and minds. Now, legally requiring every company to pursue profit with purpose and without problems will simply not have the effect that Colin, I think, would like in the absence of change of that sort. And indeed, it would be difficult to introduce that kind of requirement without that kind of deeper change. And taking that a step further, the experience of successive COPs should leave us in no doubt at all about the challenges of doing so on a universal basis. But in fairness to Colin, I do sense from the book that he recognises that, but he's pushing us to have the conversation nonetheless, and that's a good thing. So to me, the real question concerns how, through a change in social norms, potentially supported and nurtured by law, we could move business activity closer towards realising core socially valued outcomes. And that is an enormously complex question. But at least part of it, I think, involves a widespread re-evaluation of the stories we understand ourselves to be part of. The social narrative social narratives that make sense of the reality before us. And I think the book is very much playing into that kind of reevaluation. Now, these narratives are behaviorally incredibly important because they focus individual and institutional desires on some goals rather than others. They frame behavioral decisions in pursuit of those goals. And then as activity proceeds, they form people and institutions, their character and their culture. So they have a three-part effect. They focus, they frame, and they form. And in other words, what they do is ultimately they affect norms. The Wolf of Wall Street, Homo economicus, shareholder value, invisible hand myths leave little room for goals beyond narrow financial return. The alternative, or an alternative, that I examine in my own book is the growing recognition that businesses are given a social license, which seems to me to point us towards the kind of balancing of interests and goals which is fundamental to the resilience of economic systems. I believe that many in the business community have an aspiration towards that kind of balance, but existing mental frameworks, among other things, diminish its salience. Colin's book, I think, is rightly an urgent call to pay attention to it before it's too late.
Thank you, David. Very stimulating. I think we can hopefully pick up some of the conversation about the kinds of regulation that's needed, the relationship between laws to social norms to wider narratives. Really, really helpful. Andrew, it'd be lovely to come to you. And I guess we're really grateful for the way in which you can bring a perspective from right across this this discourse. You read and review so much of the literature. And indeed have looked at Colin's book already as part of that. How are you seeing this discussion as it's unfolding, but the book itself?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to take part. I'm going to try not to duplicate what Sarah and David have said, but there will be a little bit of overlap. But I will overlap entirely in paying tribute to Colin for having, fought this fight over so long, and not only as a thinker, a philosopher really of business, but also as a sort of doer in bringing those ideas to bear in lots of the areas where he's worked. I remember an early encounter with Colin on a round table when he was not exactly a lone voice, but a rare voice in pointing out the value of block shareholdings, family ownership, and alternative models to what was then and what is still in the UK, certainly the dominant model of diffuse and dispersed shareholder ownership, which I think the book explains is one of the reasons why we end up with what Colin calls crisis capitalism in countries like the UK and to some degree the US. But I want to focus on the practical in what I'd briefly say here, because one point that Colin didn't mention in his presentation explicitly was this idea of bringing business to understand, or indeed business and the system as a whole, to work according to this universal moral law that he poses, do unto others as they would have done unto them, which is obviously distinct, rightly, from the golden rule about do as you would be done by. And that moral law, or at least the universality of it, and I'm picking up here a little bit on what David said, I'm just concerned that for all the success of individual moral companies and economies, and Handelsbanken is one of them, Denmark is one of them, Sweden is one of them, that the moral law is still going to be easily undercut by the short-term amoral or immoral, even crisis capitalists or economies that work according to that, be that from Beijing or from Birmingham for that matter. And And so this systemic change that is necessary in order to make some of these ideas work, and without wanting to be fatalistic about it, I feel like it's a huge ask, and I'm eager to hear more from Colin about how one gets to that sort of point where things do align. Is it a tipping point where we suddenly all realize that good firms should be outcompeted by better firms, not undercut by worse ones? Is it gradual? What are the first steps in this? Because it seems to me that in the UK and the US particularly, the chance of moving to more regulation and legislation in this area, again, picking up a little bit on what David and to some degree Sarah said, is dwindling. We're into reducing the burden rather than increasing it. I listened to a lecture to the Institute of Business Ethics the other night by Richard Moriarty from the new Financial Reporting Council head, and he's full of common sense ideas. I found him very convincing, but he's about stripping away governance rules and reducing, making sure that the ratchet doesn't always add to the burden on business. And obviously in the US, you've got the spectre of the return of Trump, who similarly and indeed far more radically is likely to aim to reduce the burden and take away rather than add to any legislative or regulatory attempts to bring business into line. So I suppose that is my big question. What are the first steps? How do we move forward if we can't guarantee that everyone will move forward together? And as I raised in the review of the book, I give Colin a right of reply on the closing point of that review, which was, obviously shareholder capitalism, as Colin acknowledges in the book, is about clarity and simplicity, and hard-pressed business people, even ones with the right idea and a moral compass, are always going to opt for clarity and simplicity over complexity and nuance if it gets them to their destination quicker. And finally, I was just amused, and I don't know whether anyone spotted it, that the FT had a headline the other day because Colin mentioned water companies about Thames Water, which I thought was the classic dog bites man shareholder primacy business done in the old way headline, which was Thames Water lobbies for higher bills, dividend payouts and lower fines, which seemed like the absolute encapsulation of what Colin's book is working against. I'll just leave it there and then we can have a chat.
Thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. And maybe we'll pick up with the final point on clarity and simplicity. Hope, how's this working? Colin, let's come back to you if that's all right. There's lots here to pick up on. Any ideas that are going to help us to ride the waves in and amongst what you've heard, and what thoughts might you have in response to some of the comments?
Well, first of all, let me say that they were uniformly brilliant comments, and thank you very much indeed to all of you for having thought so carefully on these issues. First of all, just picking up on Andrew's last remark about Thames Water, that does encapsulate absolutely perfectly precisely the problem that I think that we're currently facing. And indeed, the common theme amongst all of the comments is, well, actually, how do we make this happen? How do we catalyze change, as Sarah put it, and strengthen the moral leadership to navigate? And she asked, am I optimistic? To which the answer is absolutely optimistic. And I hope I'll explain why. So I think David really set it out very clearly when he said that it is critical to bring about any effective change, that there is a shift in behavioral norms and socially accepted principles for there to be any response in terms of either business practice or policy formulation. One will not get a shift in law without this. And just to pick up on Andrew's point, really the main message I'm trying to emphasize is that regulation per se is not the right approach. One has to look at it intrinsically within the nature of business itself, and that business and that nature of business derives from the laws that define the nature of what a firm is. So what is going to bring about those changes? The first thing that I believe is critical is that it's all very well us talking about this and saying what we think are the right approaches. But really, at the end of the day, that change in social norm reflects a popular sentiment as to what is right or wrong by many criteria. And so it's critically important that whatever we say on this subject is something that people can really grasp and understand and believe in straight away. And to give you an illustration of what people cannot understand and grasp, but is talked about all of the time, it's these notions of single materiality, double materiality, extrinsic, intrinsic, and those things just don't mean anything to most people, and so are not really going to galvanize popular opinion. The reason why I've placed emphasis on this notion of profit from creating benefits for us, not harm, is that is about as simple a message as one can convey, and that you shouldn't be subject to companies profiting at your expense. I think everyone can grasp that notion. And then the natural response is, yes, well, that's right, but that's the way it is. There's nothing that can be done about it. They're going to go on. That's the way they are. And then once one's got the notion as to what it is that one's really trying to get to, then one can begin to say, well, what is it that's needed to change to bring about at least the idea that companies are benefiting from conferring benefit on you and society as a whole. So that's part one. And what I see happening is a growing realization of exactly that point. Now, the question is, how many crises is it going to, more crises is it going to take until it really strikes everyone as requiring an immediate way of addressing that problem? Is unclear, but we are on the path to it. The second thing that makes me optimistic is technology. We think about a lot of the negative elements of technology. I think in this area, technology is potentially incredibly powerful. It allows us, for example, through satellite technology, to see exactly what's happening to every leaf in a forest. In terms of deterioration of natural capital in the environment, who owns it, who's responsible for that. We will increasingly, through a combination of social media, AI, satellites, etc., be able to assess whether or not companies are profiting at our expense. Okay, so the ability to hold companies to account is going to increase. The next element then is to say, well, how do we get from the realization and the ability to do something to actually taking the steps? And here, Andrew's point about, well, it's not really in any country's interest to go against the grain. I think that there's a realization that it can go the other way. And actually, Gillian Tett's got an interesting piece on this in the FT today, that what the EU is trying to do is, in essence, create the Brussels effect. That is to say that virtually every company, major company in the world, is affected by what Brussels decides. Okay, and so once there is an element of enlightenment about, and I'm not saying that necessarily what the EU is trying to do is the right approach, but once some significant entity takes a view that change needs to happen, it can then spread really quite rapidly in terms of the way in which all countries have to respond. So for those reasons, if none other, then I am certainly remaining very optimistic about the extent to which we can reform the system.
Thank you, Colin. Colin, just as you continue to reflect, there are a couple of more technical and longer questions in the Q&A box. I wonder if you might have a look through those, and then as we come back to you in a moment, maybe you could offer one or two thoughts in response rather than reading those out. It might take a moment to digest. In the meantime, Sarah, back to you, and then on hope. Colin's hopeful and has given us some reasons why. You speak to a lot of senior leaders who are thinking about some of these questions very practically, because they're there and they've got to make business decisions based on which way they're going to go. And they're obviously personal questions as well. How do you respond to some of the reasons Colin's given us for hope, and what's your perception of talking these things through with senior leaders?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that Colin's hopeful, and I really agree with some of the reasons why he's hopeful. I think, as much as we like to think, well, some of us like to think that we are rational, data-led, scientifically minded beings, we're also humans with emotions, and actually there's the social norms in which we operate are really significant drivers of our decisions and behaviors. And I think the social contagion around this is going to be perhaps one of the most powerful forces to affect this rapid change. So I think as some of the leaders that we speak to, they see other leaders thinking about this and talking about this, and it gives them courage, confidence to act and not feel like an outlier. And I think the more that these stories get shared, as David said, of where people and organizations and leaders and countries and governments or towns are taking a different view and finding success in lots of different ways of talking about success, I think it gives people a sense that it's possible, and that if they begin, good things might occur and they're not going to get laughed out of town. So I think the social contagion point, whether it comes from seeing other people do it, or, as Colin said, with technology, the increasing transparency and accountability and awareness that forces that sort of social norm on organizations and leaders, I do think that's a really powerful agent of change. We're social beings, we want to feel like we are doing good in the world and are respected for doing so. And even business leaders, perhaps particularly business leaders, because they have such a huge impact and such a high public profile, and such a great degree of sort of accountability and public critique. So I think things are changing, and what is deemed to be a successful leader in this space is changing quite rapidly. And I think actually that's going to be a very powerful force in hopefully getting us more quickly to the future that Colin envisages.
Andrew, you've thought a lot about leadership, written a lot about leadership. How do you perceive where leaders are up to here? And to your point around clarity and simplicity, is there a narrative which is emerging here which you think can be sufficiently clear and simple for leaders to take on, and for practices to start to change, the kinds of habitus that David was talking about?
Yeah, I think, well, I thought Colin's response was very good on that, obviously on the point about the simplicity of understanding that profits come from creating benefit rather than from creating harm. And that is, everyone can understand that. One point that occurred to me, which we haven't raised yet, is the part of these social norms changing are social norms changing among the people who leaders lead. So the actual employee pressure that we see emerging in various businesses, for which I think many leaders don't have a very clear answer yet. They're concerned that they have to speak out on political issues, that they have to have a position, and this is true in a lot of companies, they do. But I wonder whether the most powerful social norm at work within, or change in a social norm at work within companies, is this one about saying, I'm simply not going to work for a company that doesn't show that it is benefiting, and I'm not going to have the wool pulled over my eyes any longer by a superficial purpose statement. I'm going to want to see that happening. And I think that is at work within everything from the obvious places, big fossil fuels companies, through to the less obvious consulting firms, advertising agencies and others, where individual staff are refusing to work on some accounts, which don't seem to be pointing in the right direction. So I think that is one element of further optimism. And it goes to what Sarah was saying about the change in the type of leader who has to deal with that. You know, when I started in business or in journalism, you know, that was the sort of hierarchical top down, we'll do this and we'll take our pay at the end of the month. And the element of protest within the company that you now see in all companies, particularly from younger employees, was simply not there. So that is a sign, I think, of a positive shift.
This is relevant very much to our third question here in the that's come up from an economics teacher, wonderfully, which relates then to the next generation, shaping narratives, shaping norms, and we know this next generation is highly motivated when it comes to purpose, and is taking a view which is making then senior leaders stop and reflect. David, perhaps come to you here. How would you talk about the ways that narratives can work? They focus, they frame, they form. Very specifically then, how does that work educationally? How can we help those in schools, in business schools and so on to think about new narratives, new norms? Any advice there?
Well, my suspicion is, and I've never, Colin is obviously an expert on what goes on in business schools, but my suspicion is that this kind of material has traditionally been sort of chucked into sort of business ethics courses and treated as responsible business. And I think what needs to happen essentially is that the two needs to be fundamentally stitched together, so that we link the idea, people's aspirations with purpose. And by purpose, I don't mean narrow financial return. And so, you know, whether we do it through the narratives, I think we do need to, I mean, the Homo economicus shareholder myth narratives are being deconstructed, and economists have known that they are nothing more than models for a long time. But I think when you talk to people who come out of business schools, very often these sorts of frameworks are absolutely baked in, and there's been research on it to show the effect that has on people's behavior. So I think there's probably quite a lot of deconstructing that needs to go on in economics, and especially my area, financial economics teaching. Some of the issues that we're dealing with in the investment industry are absolutely driven by financial economics and the assumptions that underpin it. So I certainly think there's a lot of work to be done there in re-evaluating those narratives and putting in parallel, not replacing them, because they tell us something about reality, but supplementing them with a wider, holding them, if you like, within a wider view of reality.
Thank you, Colin. Do you want to pick up there? There's other points as well. We've probably got time for you to bring some threads together if you'd like to, as we head to the top of the hour.
So I'd like to first of all pick up on this question about teaching and education, which is critically important. And I'll just make one observation that I think I've been very struck by over the last year or so, and that is the extent to which we are overwhelmed by demand from business to create courses in the field of sustainability and areas like that. It's been a massive change over the last couple of years. And I think it reflects a very significant change in attitude on the part of companies about the type of education that they want their people to have. And coming to the question from a teacher within a school, I think that there is nothing better that can be done to promote teaching than to emphasize the fact that the role that business plays is one that is central to the prosperity of us as individuals and societies and the environment. And that is the way in which going forward, we are going to be structuring our business. And we need to educate that next generation in terms of what is needed to achieve that. The final point I would make is that policy does need to have a basis in things that can be effectively implemented. And the first question in the Q&A asks about the relevance of land and land taxes and things like that on the basis of them being immobile. This is a good illustration of an area where we have not really exploited the extent to which we can use the tax system as a mechanism for shifting resources between companies that are from companies that are wading in the weeds of exploitation, expropriation, and unjust enrichment, and transferring those excess profits to companies that are struggling to really create benefits for others. The tax system is potentially a very valuable tool, and as the questioner points out, the use of property and land taxes to do that is something that hasn't been fully exploited to date. Thank you.
Oh, we're just getting started. There's so much more to talk about, but it was always going to be thus in an hour with this fantastic group, and Colin, the terrific books that you've written to help us to start to think and to act as well. I've been verily and happily encouraged by the hope in the room, and some of the steps that we can start to think about taking as well. Sarah, David, Andrew, very many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon. Colin, in particular, thanks to you. Thank you for this fantastic book and all the work that's gone into it. But thank you, moreover, for your purpose-driven and moral leadership leading us in this really important work over so many years. We're very grateful indeed to you. Thank you for joining us today. And all the best as you go into the afternoon, the weekend ahead. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's been lovely to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.